Good evening. Welcome to the grand finale of Justice After Dark on this special day, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I'm Patrick Leland.
And of course, I'm Trudy Bell, and we join here again another night to share ideas and just to have a discussion, especially around this topic. This has been a 10-week series, and we are culminating tonight. This is our final night here for Justice After Dark. So, Patrick,
Yes,
how's it been?
it's like it was just number one the other
I
day,
know,
and we
right?
are at 10
Yeah,
now.
man.
But today is indeed a special day as we celebrate International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. We are here tonight to talk with survivors, supporters, and providers of services for these survivors, the services that are so badly needed to help them get through their episodes of violence.
All right, so listen, people, we want to know if listen in, join in on the discussions, ask the questions that you need to ask. You know, we have people here that they're going to be sharing their experiences and all of that. So, without further ado, let's get into introducing who we have here tonight.
So tonight we will be looking at the topic End Violence Against Women Now through a survivor-focused lens. Tonight we have a panel of survivors and persons who provide services for them. And we will not only be hearing how they survived, but we'll be hearing how their survival was connected to these various services that are provided by the providers we have here on set. So tonight, to start, because it's a survivor-focused week, we want to first welcome the two survivors that will be sharing with us, Monique and Rochelle. Good night, ladies.
Good night, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks for having me as well.
Thanks for being here. And now, as it relates to the providers, let me just welcome the leader of this entity that has been doing such an awesome, such a phenomenal job, Candace Livermore. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good night. Thank you for having me.
Our next guest is a woman that gives a voice to the young girls through her work, Executive Director of E for Life, Joy Crawford. Welcome, Joy.
Thank you so much.
And the lady who will go all the way to the court, if needs be, attorney at law and legal support officer for JASL, Jamaica Aid Support for Life, Jade Williams.
Good night, everybody.
Welcome, Jade.
And we also have the leader of the entity that has been at the forefront of providing shelter for survivors over the years, Executive Director of Woman Inc., Joyce Hewitt. Joyce?
Good evening, all. Thank you for having me, and thank you for keeping this discussion in the fore.
Thank you so much for being with us, Joy. So we're going to get right into the discussion this week. And while we will hear from survivors how they experience violence, I want to remind the listeners this week we are focusing on survival. So it's not all about the sad stories, but it's the powerful stories about these providers that we'll be hearing from who provide these well-needed services to ensure that these ladies can survive their episodes of violence.
All right, so let's just get right into it. So for Rochelle and Monique, please share with us what was your experience as it relates to violence. Rochelle, you can go first.
Okay, hi everyone again. So in terms of my experience of violence, so I experienced childhood rape at age 9 by my stepfather. At that time, not knowing much information, not having anybody. My mother was a mother who she was always busy working. So she's about providing for her children, of course, and she would left me with my father, who should have been my protector, but that wasn't the case. My grandmother was in the house, but then it didn't take place at my house. It took place at my stepfather's house, because that's where I had to stay in the evenings when I leave school. went on for a couple of months, and I told my grandmother something was happening. I had an itch in my vagina, and I told my grandmother, so she took me to the hospital. And that's where they knew that I was sexually active. So a report was made, of course, but he was never caught and he was never charged.
Mm.
Wow. Sorry to hear that. Monique, can you share what your story or what your experience was? Are you hearing me, Monique?
We seem as though we lost Monique.
All
I'm
right,
not
so we'll
seeing.
come back to Monique. Is she back? We'll come back to Monique when we get her back online. Let us move over to one of the providers. When you hear Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, you think about HIV, providing testing and treatment if you are positive for HIV. So why is addressing violence against women of any importance to JASL? Mrs. Level.
Well, I have a question at the beginning. So, yes, you would normally think about HIV, direct services. But one thing that we would have recognized here at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life is that no issue stands on its own. Usually, there are underlying issues, there are drivers in instances, and sometimes what we're seeing presenting to us is really symptomatic of other things. So for HIV, what we're seeing, um, violence presents itself. It presented itself, and so we have now classified it as cross-cutting gender-based violence because we are seeing it popping up in so many spheres of the work that we do. So we are seeing a direct relationship between HIV and gender-based violence, especially violence against women. We have within our cohort of persons who access our services women who have experienced sexual violence, rape, um, battery even. We have women who experience intimate partner violence, physical abuse, and we are seeing where one, persons have contracted HIV via these acts of violence that were committed against them. And two, we're seeing where a woman who is living with HIV is at increased risk of violence, especially upon disclosure or persons within her immediate circle becomes aware of their HIV, become aware of their HIV status. So, as an organization that is responding to HIV, it is not prudent for us to just talk about, ensuring that people are tested, know their status. If they are positive, they just get medication, and we expect that the situation will go away. We have seen also where when violence is in the mix, it acts as a barrier for that woman, that young girl, to actually adhere to any kind of program. Any kind of program, So, yes, it is well and good that the person has been, you're happy when, in a sense, that you are able to put someone on treatment. But then that in that moment that goes because then the person will not be adhering to their medication. So remember, treatment presents to us an opportunity for persons to live their best lives. But then immediately that goes if the person cannot take the medication. So what we have had to do as an organization is to find a way to institutionalize how we respond, especially to persons who are experiencing violence. I must tell you, it's not just the women though. But the women, of course, that's where we're seeing a majority of the cases that are gender-based violence and related. So we have kind of institutionalized in our programs a mechanism to do an initial assessment of clients that come to us. Even if you're doing HIV testing, you might wonder why I just want to know some things. It's because we know that these things impact other things. So today you might be tested negative, but for example, if you had answered my question to have you ever experienced any form of violence before, then it might lead us into a discussion that shows us that you are at an increased risk of contracting HIV later on. And so there needs to be a wider response to your situation. And of course, for treatment, we will get into way more details because we want to, you know, having a HIV positive diagnosis can be a trouble, you know, troublesome for the clients, and it's a process. But we don't want to add layers to that. We want to be able to give full support, a comprehensive program to ensure that that person can get their life back on track. And so we will engage more with you. And of course, the response can mean anything from, you know, an initial counseling session to engaging with a psychologist to going into psychotherapy if needed over a period of time to looking at, you know, sometimes we find violence take us to working with the children and the family system. It might bring us into the courts. We have seen where it might even take us to a situation of, you know, resolving domestic issues around housing, issues around economic independence and a woman's ability to take care of herself and her children. And so what we have tried to do at JASL is, it's not like we're running down work, I'm just saying that, but we would not be true to ourselves if we don't have a comprehensive response to anything that will negatively impact someone's HIV status or their ability to live positively with HIV.
Wow, if you have any doubts about why Jocelyn is concerned about violence against women, there you have the answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like the fact that, you know, it's very comprehensive. It's not just, okay, we are an HIV syphilis testing organization and that's just it, you know. I love the way that you guys go above and beyond Call of Duty. So I just want to throw the next question to Joy from Eve for Life, right? So Joy, my question to you is, what is your organization doing to reduce or to end violence against women?
Thank you so much, Trudy, and good afternoon or good night again to everyone. What does E for Life do to end or impact the issue of what's happening? I'd want to think that it starts from the very core of what we do. We are an organization that ensures that the sexual reproductive health rights of our girls in particular is upheld, and that they get the resources and the environment within the Jamaican context, of course, to live their best life.
Right.
And so, if you think about the issue around sexual reproductive health of our girls, one can understand that anything that is a violation of that becomes our issue. The typical profile of our client would be the adolescent girl in Jamaica who would have been raped or who have experienced incest. As a result of that, she may have become pregnant, and therefore she enters into the system of the PMTCT program, which is mandatory in our country that they get tested for HIV. And then she gets an HIV test result that says, I am living with HIV now. And if you think about all the cross-cutting issues with that, so she should have had her education interrupted, family definitely, the issues around stigma, discrimination, and or most times shaming and ridicule. She goes to a healthcare system which culturally says young girl breed because them bad. And then the whole issue around how does this girl get protection from child protection entities, the legal system, often the experience of the fact that simply because she is not an adult woman, her life become more complex. So you hear the things about the fact that nothing happened because they didn't have power to speak, or they weren't heard, or they weren't believed, or they weren't supported to get beyond the particular incident. So those are the profile issues. So when they come to us to seek our services, which would fit into any of those profiles that I've said, then we have to look at the issue of sexual violence. There is no way we can look at the prevalence of HIV in adolescent girls in Jamaica who are not vertically transmission, meaning that they weren't born with HIV, and deny the fact that we have a serious issue with the link between sex that came into their life and then HIV. And so for us, very early, we recognize that even though we are a part of the HIV response in Jamaica, we heavily have to look at the issue around sexual violence, because there's no doubt we don't have to wonder what is happening to our girls 18 and under. And so our approach is to ensure that we place the violence, the sexual violence, at the top of the response, because it is usually the primary issue for them at that time. We find that the pregnancy and the HIV diagnosis, while it is there, the trauma of the sexual violence is more urgent and pronounced on their list of things. We offer a lot of the services that Candice mentioned, but I think what is important for us is that we have what we call ROAR, ROAR. It's a program that says we want to restore order to all relationships. And of course, the first one is relationship to self. So we invest a lot in the survivor, the survivor's livelihood. How do we help the survivor to face the incident, the people in the incident, the entities in the incident, whatever it is that was happening? How do we help that survivor to start a healing process, to not accept the blame that was placed on them, to deal with issues of what justice will look like for them, not what people are telling them? Is it that they just want forgiveness? Is it that they want to go all the way to legal, whatever it is? But to make it this client-centered, we listen to the survivors and we do what is it that they would like to do at that time. And it's a little different from most spaces where there is a set agenda that, okay, if this happened to you, you must do A, B, C, D, and Y. That's not what we do. And we can't do at where we enter the life of the survivor. So our thing is, what is that the survivor require from us? So that's the first part of it. The other part is now, how do we restore relationship to the perpetrator? And people want to know why. Why is the perpetrator? Again, this comes out of what the girls would want. That perpetrator have several faces. Most time it's somebody that they know, and often it's a biological person. What does that mean? So for example, the girl who's impregnated by her father, and because in Jamaica we don't have legal and safe abortions, and we have everybody else having an opinion that she must carry the child, most times will carry the baby. But then she now has to tell her child that your father is your grandfather. When that is asked of us, I usually don't have an answer. It's one of those anger and frustrating situation, but then putting yourself in that young woman's shoe. So how do we help her now to come to her own space with this perpetrator? One of the perpetrators that we find is the parents, the mothers. We have been asked if the law says that if somebody know and don't say anything, we want to charge them $500,000 or put them in prison. But we told our parents, we told our mother, she knew, she didn't do anything. Can I take her to court? Right. Should she be charged the $500,000? And so these things come up, and they grapple with these things. The perpetrator, you know, what do we do? And again, I'll say that it's very different from an adult situation, because they lack the agency simply because they're younger. You know, the support that they need, for example, to lock up a mother in a family that says, how dare you lock up your mother? Yeah. And they're still living in the house. So the perpetrator sometimes is not just the person who carry out the act. It is the family environment. And there's nowhere else for them to go. And, you know, so there's so much that goes on that we have to work through. And the last part of the roar is, how do we help them now to restore order to the rest of the society? The failures and or the support. And so we use that three-pronged approach to work with survivors. The big part of it, which is what we're doing now, we've been doing this in a very targeted way for about 6 years, is the community, the physical geographic community. So about 3 or 4 years ago, we started to look at communities where the girls live. How do we engage those communities to create safer spaces for them? And communities that are high risk based on the data, and a lot of it is about where are the communities that you see high HIV prevalence, where are the communities that you see high crime, where are the communities that the data is telling that there is high incidence of rape. So we look at these communities and we have targeted them over the number of years. And so what we have now is what we call our community change champions, where the communities that in which our young women live and have to interact are transforming based on the community change champions now which is the wider community encapsulating this one girl who is a survivor. So that is really how we do it and how we focus on it, while of course doing the other services, which is the counseling and the economic empowerment and those other things. But for us, we have over the years developed a focus and almost like a best practice system to have girls now move from the incident as a victim to what they now say we are survivors. And about 2 years ago, we were now told we are no longer survivors, we're now overcomers. So it's how do we move the person from that so that when they're accessing the HIV service and all other things that are required for them, the survivor is now in a good space or a better space to take on the other things that we want to give them as a society.
Thank you, Joy. That's a lot. That's a whole lot of work. I can't imagine what it takes to do all of that. But let's bring in Joyce here. Joyce, who is joining us online. While we're still trying to sort out Monique's connection, we'll come to Monique after this. What?
She's waiting to be let in, as well as the audio is very low, Patrick. So persons on Facebook is having a challenge hearing.
Okay. So the technical team is trying to sort that out. So we're gonna come to Monique shortly. Let me just bring Joyce in here, asking. Someone says they recommend someone to Woman Inc. as somewhere that can help women who are experiencing violence. What exactly does Women Inc. do for persons in these situations? Joyce.
One of the main things that Woman Inc. does is first and foremost providing counseling by way of telephone primarily, as well as walk-in during the course of the week, which is Monday through Friday during normal business hours. And then, of course, after the business hours have ended, there is a telephone, which is, we refer to it as a hotline, which is manned by volunteers, both male and female, who respond to each and every call. And it is a question of the counselor who is at the end of the telephone, who is on the hotline, who must then decide what kind of information they're getting and what needs to be done. It can range, for example, from someone who is at high risk and needs to be rescued at once and placed in the shelter. If that is the situation, what happens is that the counselor on duty will then refer to what we call the backup, because it's always a matter of two heads being better than one, and they will be able to share with their backup first and foremost and say, this is what has been the information I've received, and this is what I consider needs to be done. If they both concur at that point and there is a rescue that is needed, more often than not, the police are then also called in. In most cases, we have a cadre of police who will assist in ensuring that the victim is either brought in by way of their going into the neighborhood or the community, and ensuring, of course, that they get to the shelter. And that is in the case of what we call one of the worst scenarios. Now, in between that, of course, as a rule, the key element is the listening aspect. And that listening is what determines for the counselor whether it is during the course of the day that they receive a call or during the nights, weekends, holidays, you name it, that they will then perhaps refer, if there's a need for referral, they will refer the person to come in for further counseling during the course of the day or to call in. There are some instances also where it might not even be a primary case of gender-based violence, but something else going on. For example, is there a health crisis such as HIV that is driving the person to feel the need to reach out? And if that is the case, then the situation is twofold. And it is that they would also refer to a place like, of course, JASL, and in the meantime, assist as best as possible as well with regard to any elements other than the health issue. Now then, one of the things I'd like to mention, when we talk about and think about the HIV and the relationship of HIV and gender-based violence. And about 4 years, 5 years ago now, we had a pilot project whereby it was the health policy project, and we were able to look at the process that when a person goes into the clinic, which is the comprehensive health clinic, and goes for their treatment with regard to HIV, that there was no screening being done at the time with regard to what else is going on in that person's life. And the fact that all too often, once we discovered, of course, through that pilot, was that many times, even the nurses and some of the officers who were in charge of ensuring that the candidate was really adhering to what they needed to adhere to with regard to medication. And we found out that they themselves wanted and needed some level of it was more like they wanted more information, and they were very receptive to all forms of training to understand that it was them who became the catalyst for ensuring that not only the person was treated for their HIV status, but also that there was sufficient screening to determine whether or not there was gender-based violence going on in the person's lives. That pilot was then repeated, and about 4 other clinics were added about 2 years later to that process, so that it proved to us that the interrelatedness of both gender-based violence and HIV is very, very, very important in all of the clients' lives. And that's one of the key things that we do. We make sure that each and every volunteer who is on the hotline is then trained sufficiently to respond to those kinds of situations. Of course, we have the shelter, which we've had for nearly 37 years. And up until last year, when the government opened another shelter, we were the only shelter in Jamaica, in the entire island. And that shelter still, of course, is maintained, and it exists in Kingston only. And while the government, in fact, has now put up another shelter in an out-of-town location, of course, the need for shelters is even greater than ever. Above and
Thank you for sharing
beyond
that,
that,
Joyce. I want to come back. I want to stop you there because there is something I want to interrogate on that point that you just raised on the issue of the shelter. But before I do that, let me allow Monique to share her experience of violence with us.
okay, thank you.
Hi again. Hi. Good night, everyone.
Are we asking our guests online to turn their cameras on, please?
Really?
Where possible. If it's not possible, that's okay.
Alright. So, hi. Good night. So, I am a sexual survivor. I was sexual abused by my uncle at the age of 12. How I get through this, I was introduced to E for Life, where I do various training discovery workshop and all of those stuff. It reached to a point where I started to write about my story, that everything that happened to me, I started to write. So my impression is that writing was one of my healing as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Monique.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you very much for sharing, Monique. I just want to go over to Jade a bit. Jade, I wanted to know where do you as a lawyer, where do you fit in all of this?
Okay. Thank you, Trudy, for that question, and good night again, everyone. Um, it's nuanced where I fit in because as everyone who's spoken before, Mrs. Livermore, Joy, and Joyce would have said, when we're dealing with violence, it is a multifaceted issue. So there has to be a combination of approaches. And I found that it's impossible to address the issues holistically, legally, without any additional support. So my role really is to assess the legal avenues that the client can take, and to assist the client through doing so, whether that is directly through my desk or through one of our partners, which that could be JFJ, who is one of our partner NGOs, or with a private attorney, but a vast majority of our matters are handled through me. And it would be a similar approach that any legal professional would take. I'd assess the matter. I would say, okay, based on what you're saying here, we would get a protection order, we'd get an occupation order. Depending on the seriousness of what has occurred, we would need to support the client through making a report to the police, and using a police officer that would have been sensitized to these issues, because we found that that is one of the reasons that sometimes domestic violence cases or gender-based violence cases where it's violence against women don't really go forward. So we provide that kind of support to clients, but also a lot of my work is finding additional support for the client so that the legal aspect of the matter can go off. And that is where the rest of my team at Jassel is really important and supportive to that. So we would have our counselors and our psychologists on staff that would be able to help with the psychological issues. We have our social worker that can help provide some of the economic opportunities that might bring the client to a financial situation that might make it easier to seek legal redress. And yeah, we work together to bring the client to a point where they feel as though the legal redress option is now something that they can handle, and then we go forth from there.
Got you. Thank you.
Interesting.
Awesome.
The Monique spoke earlier and she mentioned that writing was something that helped her to deal with. She said writing was her healing, something to that effect. So I want to throw the question to Rochelle, and I think Monique answered this question already. What is it that helped you most deal with um, your experience of violence? What helps you most deal with it? And I want you to share that so that people out there can maybe hear something that can help, and also the providers can hear what is it that survivors need to help them to cope. So what helps you cope?
Okay, so at that time, I can't recall in terms of, it's just the creator himself that helped me. I was young, going to school. I remember my mother always said, because I was given trouble, I really was crying out for help, to be honest. And her statement was, which most Jamaican parents, if you don't behave yourself, I'm going to send you go cops. Now, cops is in Anova, and it was a girls' home then. And for me, every day I left school, I tried to do something that I would get in trouble, so I could go to cops, so I would feel safer.
Right.
No, that was then. I've met Ifa Life. So after all of that, I just was just coping, just hanging on, really. It's just having faith, to be honest, that one day it will get better. I've always been told that I'm a strong person, so I guess I had that. So meeting If Alive in 2012, that was really when it started for me in terms of getting the help that I truly needed as a survivor. At that time, I saw myself as a victim. I was very shy. I didn't speak much. I really didn't have much to say. I used to walk with my head held down because for me, I felt as though my power was taken. I couldn't have spoke because, I mean, everything was taken from me as an innocent child. Now, meeting If Life and going through a lot of training that Monique spoke about, some of them in terms of heart therapy, finding yourself, who am I? Knowing that, look, you have your power, you have your voice, and learning to forgive, and forgiveness is not for my perpetrator, but for myself to move on. For me, knowing that I don't want any pity, right? I don't want anybody to tell me that, oh, I'm sorry. I don't need that. I need to know that I am a better person every single day, and knowing I've learned and I've accepted that whatever happened to me, I can be able to break the silence within my own family. As it's important to point out that all the females in my family were raped at an early age. And having a daughter at 14, it has always been my priority to stop that cycle. As we're going to talk about the generational cycle, and we leave it it's as if it's fine, and it's not fine with me. It has to be stopped. And so it's my choice that I've made. And through If Alive, with the help that I've gotten, the psychosocial aspect of it that Jade spoke about, having mentors that say, look, I was there as well, they hold your hand. You can understand, having a Mrs. Crawford as well. You have a team, a support, you're able to speak, share your story. And for each time you share your story, you feel a bit of relief. You're able, for me, can look into my abuser's eyes, because I had more than one abuser, but I chose to speak about one tonight. Let them know that you're forgiving them. It's not about them, it's really for you. Not getting the justice that I deserve. And it's fine now, but I really want it for other persons. So it's been a long journey. It's a continuous journey because I'm still in therapy, it's something that I continue to do. And it's really, I do my work, even though I have my clients that I work with, my work starts from home. And so I continue to do that with my girls and my boy to protect them as much as I can.
Wow, thank you so much, Rochelle. That was so powerful. There's so much I could unpack from what you said. But what stood out and what I'm hoping that persons listening heard you and parents heard you. You were causing trouble, being problematic to get out of a situation. And that has so rested on me since you said it, because many times in Jamaica we say the picnic just bad. The
Exactly.
girl picnic bad and a man she want,
Yes.
why she start behaving like that. And nobody takes the time to look into what is causing this child to act up. So thank you so much, Rochelle. You are so strong and so empowered to be able to look into the face of the perpetrator and say, I forgive you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rochelle. All right, so I just want to bring it back to Candace. I wanted you to expand more in terms of what does JASL do, um, yeah, for survivors.
Right. So for survivors, so the services that we have at Just as I said, it's very comprehensive. So when a survivor comes in, well, usually we don't know that the person is a survivor unless. So maybe if I tell you a bit about the process, then you can see how it works. So when a woman comes to us to access services, she might be coming in to access a HIV testing, or well, usually that's the first step. In that preliminary session, and we might be meeting that woman on the road as well. We generally ask, have you ever experienced any violence? You will be having a conversation with your tester, your counselor tester. And it can be anything. So it's really a conversation that you're having, but we're looking for certain things. Where that woman says yes, usually you care to share more, and you try to decipher where that violence comes from, whether it's still happening, if the person has passed the situation, and then you offer the service. If you from your assessment you believe that it's something that's not resolved in the person, you would say we have a psychologist in office or we have a counselor. Do you think it's something you want to explore more? And so that becomes a kind of first link for that woman to a trained psychologist who can do a preliminary session with that person. But it gets even more difficult in the sense, well, not difficult, there are other layers. So if the person is actually tested positive for HIV, there's another process that they go through. So when you come in as a new client, we do again the assessment, a total assessment of the person that talks about not just your medical history as persons would think, but we talk about your social situation, and we talk about, you know, your exposure to stigma and discrimination, violence, etc. Again, mental health assessment, all of that. Again, those things again would act as a trigger to recommend the services of a psychologist. Usually that's the first tier, all the time. A psychologist to go through in detail with you. So one service is of course the counseling. That one counseling session can translate to a whole therapy program, a program for that individual to deal with whatever it is that they are going through or that they need to address. But more than that, what we have recognized in treatment, when we're talking about HIV treatment, we have what we call a treatment readiness assessment tool that the clinician will administer to you. And basically what that tool does, it helps them to identify any barriers that may come up to your treatment that would have a negative impact on your treatment. And usually, where violence is, that's usually a barrier. Fear of violence is usually a barrier. Issues around, should my partner become aware, you know, and what the partner might do are triggers, and that will, you know, say whether or not it's even safe to take over a bottle of pills, and where am I going to keep it, how am I going to take my medication. So what we have done, you know, we would have to deal with it. But we have gone even further, where if, you know, this Jade spoke about that piece, if we find that that's something that, you know, the team will offer, do you want to talk to our legal support officer? Do you want to talk to our policy person? Especially if the situation or the experiences that the client recounts suggest that no, this can be a legal matter. And so that department, the EEHR department, will also examine the case from that angle. But we still would not leave the client there, because you do an entire social assessment to see what's happening in the home environment, if children are involved, how can we be of support. We would also go as far as to you know, see what skill sets the woman has, what the woman is doing for herself. It's a situation where they're totally dependent on their male, you know, partner, all of that. And so we go through a whole period, you know, of trainings, workshops, empowerment sessions, and we go as far as providing opportunities for employment where possible, or for developing your own micro enterprise. And so really the case, it's really, whilst we have a program, the matters are dealt with on a case by case basis. And so depending on what we use our specialists and the client will tell us where to go, and we try our very best to respond. Sometimes we can't in the moment, and we utilize our voice to get attention to the issues from where we can get the support, because just can't do it all. But we are connected. If Eve can do it in this moment, then we say, Joy, we're going to need you. If I need Joyce, we need Woman Inc. We need, and we do it like that. We go, if it's labor and social security that we need to go, we need you. So we try to connect and develop a whole referral pathway. Well, I prefer to call it a connection pathway of ensuring that the person get what they need to deal with the situation.
Got you. Thank you.
Wow, comprehensive, comprehensive. You know, as we listen here, we see the amount of work that goes into providing services to these people. We are winding down. I want Joy from listening to Rochelle and Monique and listening to Joy. I'm still hearing the connection with the empowering of survivors. And E4Life focuses a lot on empowering survivors. I want Joy, in a sentence, to tell me why. Why all this focus on empowering the survivor as opposed to go lock up the man? Why?
Okay, thank you, Patrick. He said one sentence. I was going to ask him how many words must make up that one sentence.
It can be
No full stops. All right, well, come on. Why the survivor? Because the survivor is the one who had the experience. Candace spoke, for example, about HIV, where we look at treatment readiness. If we don't start with the survivor, everything else that everybody else is doing is going to fail. Rochelle said it, Monique said it. One of the things that we recognize is that when sexual violence comes into the life of a child, there's a brokenness that takes place. Monique has a book. She's self-authored her journey. And there's one part of it that stays with me. She says, I am so glad I did not make him take my soul. And I believe that every child, boy or girl in our country, who has been raped, who has been assaulted in any way, the brokenness takes place in their soul. In that part that we can't see. The doctors are looking at the outer part, you know, the abrasions, the whatever is it, the battering, whatever it is. Some of us are looking at the social impact, you know. All our services are directed at doing something to fix what we can see. I guess in a way, I'm a survivor myself, and I think I understand it from that perspective, that there's that something that happens in your mind, in your consciousness, that really anchors everything else. And so that is why we do it. We understand from a personal perspective that if we can help that healing of soul, we can address the issues of the depression, we can the lack of self-worth, the not feeling loved, am I worthy? That sense of self-identity and self-judgment. If it's only when we do that, it's only when we can help a child to find that connection and that healing, that every other service will make sense. You know?
If
And
it's
so that is
not
why we do it.
about the survivor, it doesn't make sense.
Yes,
Wow.
well, thank you. All right, so I just want to bring it back to Joyce again from Women Inc. So Joyce, you spoke earlier about, you know, having the shelter and at one point being the only shelter in Jamaica. I wanted to know from you, why is it so important for survivors to have access to shelters?
Well, one of the most important things is that a shelter would give the survivor space, and it is a private space that they very often need, so that it takes them away from the environment in which they are being abused or have been abused. And to give them that space where it was earlier mentioned, that's where the healing starts. You cannot heal when you're still within the situation where the violence is being committed. It is very, very difficult. And that is why often, as Joy referred to, the fact that when it happens at such a young age, and it really has cut right through to the soul of the person. When you're dealing, as we are at Woman Inc., with adults, And they often also have children as well who they need to bring with them to the shelter because they cannot leave the children behind in an abusive situation because the children too are often at risk for assault or even sexual assault as well. So that the first thing that the shelter does is give them that space, that quiet time where they can start the healing process. And that is why it is strictly important for that to occur. And then now, where we have moved further, is that we have discovered that it's not just the shelter, because the shelter is, in fact, a temporary emergency situation, which it should be. But then what? We found that oftentimes the woman would leave the shelter after 2 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, whatever, and go back to the abusive situation only because they had nowhere else to go. So, what we have done recently is move from that position of temporary emergency shelter to provide what we call transition. So the transitional living situation is what not only provides that space, but it provides the healing process, and it provides her with some level of independence if in fact she needs skills, because all too often the lack of skills is also why they stay in abusive situations. So whatever the case may be, the need for the transitional living is what is the next step that we have now taken. And that is where we start to see the long-term healing really take place, and in an environment where the woman is free from not only stress, but threat. And that threat of violence is what must be removed. And that is what the shelter and now transitional living facility does, in fact, provide for them.
Thank you very much, Joy. There has been constant discussion around the fact that the legislative framework, the laws that must bring perpetrators to justice who perpetrate violence against women, that they are not enough, that they need improvement. The Domestic Violence Act is one such piece, and we have heard recent announcement of some changes to be made to that piece of legislation. I want Jane to tell us are you pleased with any of the new things you are hearing? And if so, what are those? And is there anything else that you would like to see in terms of the legislative framework that we still don't have yet?
Yes, I would say any additional consideration for protection for our most vulnerable is always something I'd welcome. So some of the considerations I've seen Minister Grinch talk about to come up for the Domestic Violence Act amendments would be, most importantly, an actual definition of what domestic violence is. Because right now, in the current state that the act is in, there is no definition of what domestic violence is. And so that you would think that that would leave it open, but it actually does a detriment to the matters that you're bringing, because at any time you could be told that this is not a domestic violence matter, and because there is no definition for you to refer to, there you'll just have to accept that. So that's one of the things that I'll accept. Just opening the discussion around what domestic violence is. I think she also mentioned consideration for the fact that different kinds of violence will now be more carefully considered. So one of the things that we've constantly noticed in things that address violence is that it addresses the physiological or the physical, so it is the physiological fallout that they would address, or the physical violence that they would address. And no one addresses more subtle forms of violence, like an emotional abuse or a psychological abuse or even an economic abuse. So that's one of the things that the minister also indicated that they would be looking at in regards to the amendments. I also welcomed the increased or the proposal to increase the fine for the breach of protection and occupation orders. Right now in the act, it is, I think, $10,000. So we are increasing it. The
Is that
proposed
US?
amendment. No, Mr. Layla, that is regular Jamaican dollars. And because it is an order that is it doesn't bring a criminal charge. It's not something that is going to put you in prison. You would want the fine to be a deterrent to breaching the order. And we can all see that, as you said, it's not 10,000 US. So that wouldn't be a sufficient deterrent to breaching this order. So one of the issues that we have found, and even as you know, in our sessions at JASA, we do a lot of legal literacy sessions with our clients, some of whom would be women who experience violence. And when we get to the section that we're talking about the utility of a protection or an occupation order, you will have persons who would have tried that route and feel as though it is not effective because, for one thing, when the order is breached, it is a simple fine to get rid of that liability, for one. And another thing is the attitude of our police officers whom we are relying on to enforce these orders. So if the order is breached, you make a report to the police, you don't go immediately back to the court. And even so, you go back to the court and the court would be sending the police to enforce the order. So if we don't have the cooperation of our officers, I don't think that any of these amendments will be successful. So I think that one of the areas that we need to be looking at more closely is the relationship between the JCF and the approaches to violence against women. Just even anecdotally, we would have heard from some of our clients going all the way to make a report only to be told, well, a man and woman business that and a police business that. Or what did you do to the man to engender this reaction? Or even in one specific case, the officer showing up to the home of the client and saying, the perpetrator, being the man in the relationship, goes out and says, oh, she's just being hysterical. You know how women are. And the officers took that as sufficient and left without having seen the person who actually called in to make the report. So, I think some of the things that, I don't know if this is really a legislative approach, but it might be, because there is nothing that speaks to how our JCF should deal with situations of vulnerable persons as clearly as it should. So that's not in our Constabulary Force Act, and it's not in any of their force orders. So I think, if anything, we need to be looking at how we can bring our law enforcement to a greater level of accountability when it comes to receiving these kinds of reports.
Wow.
Okay. Jade, for my information and anyone else who might be curious, you spoke about the proposed increased fines for the breach of the order. I'm curious, what's the proposed increase? Or the
okay, so they're considering $1 million as the threshold, which
that's an increase. That's a step way up. That sounds good.
Yeah.
yeah, it does sound good. And I wait to see how we enforce it. That's really my thing. Because like I said, amendments are great. And I am very welcoming of the fact that we're finally having this conversation in a serious way. But I think enforcement needs to be a major part of the conversation, because that is a lot of why the previous act would have failed, despite the fact that it was weak within itself.
Okay, time flies when you are having good discussion. We have exhausted our hour, so I better give each of our panelists your 30-second final word. Starting with our survivors. Monique, Rochelle, what is it that you want to say in 30 seconds, your final word to anyone out there who may be watching and thinking, knowing I'm in this situation, I wish I was like these two girls to be, dealing with it and up there talking. What do you have to say? What word do you want to leave with them now? Rochelle?
So you're a Shiro. That's it. You're a Shiro, you got this, right? I mean, you have a voice, just use it, make a report. And for it is so sad if I say this and it's good. It feels good saying it. However, the reality of it and is that the system is keep on failing us. And we need to understand that action, it should be actioning. It shouldn't be that we just have these discussions and it sounds nice and people see us and say, yes, we're survivors, and that's it. These amendments sounds good, but where is the thing taking place? Where are the shelters? We hear about them, they're promised, but we're not getting them. And it's very hypocritical that we come on these platforms most of the time and we promise these Jamaicans that, look, this is going to happen, that is going to happen, and it's not there. So yes, ladies, men, I mean, we all have a voice, but we have to cry out. We have to get these stakeholders to understand that we need the amendments to be done. We need them to be enforced. We need these safe houses because there's too much violence happening. We don't have safe houses for our women. We don't have anywhere to send them to. So it's not all jolly and happy that we speak about it, but we need them to be put in place. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. Well said. Monique?
I will say speak out, don't be afraid. It takes time.
Wow, that's important. Speak out, don't be afraid, it takes time. All right, tonight is Survivors Night, so I allowed them to surpass the 30 seconds, but I will not allow the providers to do so. So, Mrs. Nevermore, your final word.
You know, help is available in civil society. We want to focus on the fact that there's an E for Life, there's a Jamaica Aid Support for Life, there's a JC Woman Inc., JCW Plus. You know, many entities are out there. Reach out, talk to someone. You know, persons will be willing to give the support. But I can't do it 30 seconds because there's an obligation that we have to say to the government of Jamaica. You have an obligation to uphold the rights and dignity of every single Jamaican. And it can't be that we plaster these statistics year in, year out, day in, day out. COVID come, all of a sudden GBV on the radar. Christmas coming, GBV on the radar. Summer, Easter, every time of year we are on, these issues are right in front of us. We see the incidences. We have to act. I like the promises, but I will only be comforted by the changes in the legislation and the enforcement orders that Jade is asking for. That is the only thing that will comfort us.
Thank you. Joy?
Oh, 30 seconds. Jamaica, we're going to be judged by this. Shame on us if this continues. All of us. Shame on us.
Thank you very much, Joy. Joyce?
I need to say very quickly and very forcefully, until such time that the government itself stops turning a blind eye to domestic violence that is right in front of them, right along with them, right among them, there will be no changes. Until such time that they recognize that there is a need, a dire need, to ensure that it is a state, that the state is the one who takes over rather than keep putting the responsibility on the woman to bring the charges and to stick with the charges. If they make it a charge against the state and make it a criminal charge, until such time that that happens, it's all going to continue to be lip service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. And I just want to say, we pause every year to recognize this day because it is important. I ran into a woman in the passageway 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she said, "Hi, you don't remember me?" And I said, "No." She was coming from a session with the psychologist in the office, and she said, "The last time when I was in Emancipation Park with the march, I spoke to a lady and got the number, and I am here now getting the help."
Wow.
So if it was that lady alone reached in the march that year,
Made a difference.
it was good enough for me. So people ask, we keep doing this year after year because until we can stand and say violence against women is totally eradicated, then there will always be a need for us to have these discussions.
Absolutely.
Jade? Oh, Jade didn't get her final word. I'm so sorry. Jade?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. I have to say though, the persons who went before me quite sufficiently summed up my thoughts, particularly Mrs. Livermore, quite sufficiently summed up my thoughts. I am appreciative to see movement towards amendment. I would love to see some more momentum behind that movement because I know that our government has the capacity to do things with great momentum, especially with their response to our COVID-19 pandemic. And I would like us to think of violence against women as the crisis that it is, like how we think of COVID as a crisis, and address it with the same amount of fever and the same amount of momentum that we address other issues. And then hopefully, these promises can actually come to fruition to be something meaningful that affects the lives of those who are already victimized and those who have the potential to be further victimized.
No doubt about it, it can be done. We have had two versions of NIDS in 2 years or less. We can have
Can be done.
more legislation.
Right. And I just want to say that I'm very happy that the conversations are starting to be had in more public forums. Thank God for social media, because I have actually seen a shift in some of the attitudes of people as it relates to domestic violence. So we just want to continue this thrust and hope that more people will come on board because we are stronger in numbers, right? JASL, EFL, Women Inc., I want to thank you guys so much for partnering. This is something that I'm also passionate about, and I am happy to have been able to collaborate with you guys on this. And here in our Town Hall series.
It's week 10.
It's week
and
10.
This is the final episode of Justice After Dark. Thank you very much for joining us. And we don't know, we'll see you around
We will.
with something else. Thank you.
Thank you.